watched and listened to the recording that we made for this summit. To everybody or no? Okay, so like, oh, if you give me a thumbs up. So all the people who thumbs up, give me a thumbs up right now. Just the people who have already like watched it. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. And I don't know about the people who are blacked out. So how many people did not watch it? How many people did not watch it? Okay, so most people have not seen it. Okay.
That's cool. All right.
Okay.
That's kind of nice. Okay.
Okay.
So what we'll start from there is to say that, Dara, I think it'd be really nice to do opening prayer.
Yeah.
The folks,
yeah.
You guys can participate in the prayer in the ways that, are needed.
Let me just give a quick rundown for people that don't know us. That's the first time they've met me or Tada, and they're just like, what is happening? We saw a blurb. Like, so seriously, right? So like, okay. So straight up, like I'm an animist. I talk to spirits and ghosts and trees, and all of that is real, regardless of what you think or not. It's not about belief. It's just like everything's alive, has some kind of consciousness. Our ancestors knew this. And what Tada and I have found is that if you combine really solid neurobiological trauma-aware somatic therapy that isn't about discharge, it's not about discharge, okay, it's not about catharsis, but if you combine really sound neurobiology and attachment and you expand it into the animist worldview, you get some really wild healing results that are not dissociated. But you have to do it in a very particular way. And so if you want to know more, we have lots and lots of information and podcasts and all sorts of stuff, but it's a lot to think about if you've never thought about it before. So just understanding that, like we're coming from all over the place and some people are like, what's animism? And I'm, yeah, and that's just real. But the baseline is that everything is alive on some level and should be respected as such, including all the parts of yourself that are not just you, including your ancestors and other things that are floating around and floating through and floating with, right? It's an entangled paradigm. We're not separate. There's no separate here, but there is a way to organize it in a certain way where we can feel better about being so entangled. So hopefully that gives a little bit of the poetic license to sort of understand you're already entangled. If you become conscious of your entanglement, you might get shocked, but then there's a way to be cool with it eventually.
Yeah. And to say that, like, when we say that there's a particular way, it doesn't mean our way.
Yeah. Right.
And also, like, we're not indoctrinating you.
Yeah. I don't need you to join my religion. It's at all. Zero. I don't care about that whatsoever.
But I think it's just transparency to tell people what we believe in. And you're also allowed to, like, the way I invite you to engage is, does this feel right for me? It's a very complex question to the body. So I invite you just to sit with that and also know there's nothing on the table that we're putting out today that you need to just inhale. You're allowed to say, like, I don't eat raisins, and take it out. I'm going to put sauce, like, really, really, and you can just be like, I'm going to not have this today. Or I'm just going to look at this food today, and that's totally okay with me and with Dare.
Yeah, there's no demands. We're just trying to share in this particular way because conflict and justice, which are spirits, FYI, so the spirits of conflict, the spirits of justice, they have a lot of ways that they're interpreted by humans. And our interpretations might not actually be who they are as a force. Mm-hmm. So we have to come to grips with some of these like human-centric ideals that we bring around with us all the time. So hopefully we can play a little bit in that, like spreading out the distribution of things like ideals and morality and things like that. We can maybe spread it out a little bit rather than have a really fixed idea of what's right and what's wrong. Maybe we don't actually know as humans what's right and what's wrong. Maybe the earth knows better than we do. And that's part of the challenge, but also the healing. in my opinion.
Well, we are running there, but let us offer prayer. I feel like
Yeah.
just to get on the right
Yeah, of
path.
course. Yeah, yeah.
So this is a embodied prayer. So invite folks to warm your hands up, and then just pat your body down. You know, and all of this is just you with you, and then maybe even kind of pressing your body into the earth a bit, adding a little bit, very kind of witnessing pressure. We're not talking about like, but just like pressure into the earth, and then feeling the earth press back. And hereby, I like to acknowledge I'm on unceded Indigenous territory, Coast Salish lands, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. That is also known as Vancouver, BC. Derry, would you like to kind of greet the land where you are?
Yeah. Thank you to this land that I am on, this land that was traditionally stewarded by the Chinook people, Kalapuya, and many more other tribes of the Pacific Northwest. And thank you so much to those people, past, present, and future, who've tended these places. And thank you to this place itself for the rich nourishment that it provides for all the beings that are inside of it.
Right. And as we feel our presencing into the earth, I invite you to take a little breath. Let the breath be like gently land a little bit lower than you're used to. And from that place, whether, this is new to you or not, it can just be just a little playtime for you to participate in, to acknowledge in yourself the lands below, their histories of conflict, of also well-being. Wherever you may be in the world, there's been both conflict and resolution and transformation all at once, wherever you've been. And if the place where you are, where your ancestors rest, or all of them do, or some of them do, you may acknowledge that. And then also know that where you are also connects with all the lands that your ancestors have walked and rest. So this place where you are is also every place you've been. And then we don't just acknowledge the land, we let the land acknowledge ourselves, because it's a reciprocal relationship. So inviting you to notice how your body feels, what it happens inside of you when you hear the following words that invite some kind of intent or visualization. That the land says, "Hey, how are you? I see you today. I've seen you since you were born, and I will see you until you die, and beyond." And just notice what happens when that is invited. And also, I invite every one of you right now, whatever your intention is for this call today, maybe it's revelation, maybe it's healing, maybe it's insight, maybe it's play, just to hold a little bit of that in yourself in this moment, and we may see what emerges. Dare, you want to cap this off?
Yeah. So as you hold this, just allow your basket, your body, your container, just allow it to be a little bit bigger. Not too big, but just a little bit bigger. than your body itself. So just allow yourself to spread out like you're spreading out a picnic blanket so that things can have space, so that they're not all squished together, so that like the grief that's inevitably going to be here, the rage that's inevitably going to be here, but also the joy and the beauty that inevitably shows up when we talk about any of this stuff can actually just like have its own little place on the blanket, right? And so I'm just going to say thank you, and you can say thank you too, because it's beyond recognition. There's a bit of just gratitude for our precious life that we have here, even if it's troubled. So thank you to all of these wild gods, goddesses, beings, forces, animals, plants, and other beings that buoy us, that are behind us, that actually are our ancestors. And thank you to all of our ancestors that have struggled, died, lived, been born. Just thank you to all of the complications that we can't fully understand, that we're trying to understand. And blessings to all of our ancestors, regardless of what they did. But that doesn't mean we have to be close to them, but just right in this moment, mediated by the land, please send a blessing to all of our ancestors, wherever they are, however they are, wherever, however. And then just wiggle your toes a little bit, maybe touch your thighs, maybe take a big breath into your belly, maybe yawn. But just recognize we're trying to do this very embodied. We're not trying to go into a dreamland as much as we're trying to maybe dream a little bit while we're awake. Thank you. Yeah. And if you have a journal or something, you can just write down things that you experienced, maybe some sensations that you want to visit again later, maybe some colors or images that came up that you were like, whoa, that's really interesting. Maybe it was a memory and you're like, I need to explore that later. Just, save it for later, put it in your bookmarks, you know.
Helen, you have a question?
I'm speaking for two reasons. One, to be more present, and two, to acknowledge community. 6 of us on the screen seconds ago were in a session together. For me, there was not a single piece of language came to me because the emotions were so overwhelming from start to finish. And for the group, we had something larger than we could move through. So what you gave us with your prayer for me was extremely supportive and loving and wonderful. But in order to really take it in, I just wanted to speak and thank you and say, I'm so grateful to see these people who made it to this next session with me and who have just gone through that experience with me. And now we're able, or at least going to move with you. So thank you very much.
No, it's good. That's good for you from a transparency perspective. So that's real. Oh, okay, thank you, Helen. Okay, so in starting off, we like to give our main observations about how we understand conflict. So I think the subject or the title was on spirit possession, somatics, and conflict. Was that the whole thing? So I think we also want to talk a little bit about where we come from, but me and Dare said we might wait for the Q&A for that. Kind of like, let's say if you show up to a dance class you should already know who the teachers are, and just being, just being real, just joking around. But also, like, you show up to dance class, you should check your teacher's bio on the website, and then you go in and you're like, okay. And then after practice, you're like, how did you start dancing? And then there's a conversation over, food and drinks and stuff. So I feel like we're going to take that format. If that makes sense? So we're going right into it, but, there'll be, in the Q&A period, we hope to kind of answer more questions about where the work comes from, because I think those are, and it's kind of like we'll answer your questions with that in mind, to make sure that we talk about where, the history of the work that we've been doing and stuff. So conflict, it's a very big subject. The thing where the ways that we would approach conflict with an animist lens, I'm actually feeling, you know what, Dare, you go for it. I'm gonna back.
That's how we work, just so you know. We co-facilitate, we just improvise. Right. So if our ancient ancestors were not stupid, really, like if they weren't dumb, like if they actually knew something, and if the indigenous people of the world today, who have been telling our society that they need to get well with the ancestors, get well with the land, remember the original instructions, and they've been saying that for hundreds of years, right? It's like, you just go Google it, right? If they are intelligent, and in some way if they know what they're talking about, then that has to inform how we're coming to our discussions and how we make decisions around what is morality, what is ethical, what is right and wrong, what is reparations, what is accountability, right? So we have to integrate what our ancient ancestors already figured out, not thinking that they didn't know any of this stuff. But we're living in a highly colonized system that doesn't model this stuff very well. And so we're all pretty confused. Most of us are. Some people aren't confused. Some people are like, I'm still connected. I still know what's going on, how to solve conflicts in my society. Those people may or may not be on this call today. It's really, there's a bit of a disconnect with that. So let me ask just a kind of provocative question. What's the difference between inspiration and possession? And I know that there's pop culture references going to come up in our heads, and that's okay. But like, think about it just from a sense of like, you've been inspired before, right? You've had a dream before that comes from somewhere that you didn't really make up, but it gave you something, gave you a gift, maybe a poem, maybe it gave you an art, like an image that you painted, or maybe it gave you information about someone in your family. Like, it can be a lot of inspiration, right? You could have gotten a message in your dreams and it turned out to be exactly the right thing that you needed. So if that's all possible, and we call it in this culture inspiration, what's the difference between that and like possession, other than this like negative connotation that possession has, right? Like, if we take it as a level of like, there could be degrees of possession.
You got it? You're a good girl. It's very busy.
I think we have to mute somebody. Okay, cool. Sorry. Right. So it's just a bit of a provocative question. Just what's the difference in your system between inspiration and possession? And you'll find a lot of your own assumptions, cultural biases, and that's totally fine. But if we got down to just sort of like sensations and feelings, we might actually come to something that we don't actually know the answer to. They might actually be very similar. They might actually be the same process, actually. And so we have to, take it away.
So this idea of possession comes into play when I was kind of racking my head, and I have a really big stake in restorative justice work. And I was racking my head over like, why does violence happen? And especially, things like we're talking like sexual trauma, relational violence, and relational violence of all kinds. And I've read an account is that when people are doing these things, there's descriptions in them actually being dissociated. So we very, very seldom hear from perpetrators, so-called, of violence. We never hear their personal story often of what it felt like for them to be enacting a pretty extreme case of violence, let's say in their own family. And one of the things that keeps coming up when you can actually listen, and we just have very little account, is that the person describes, I was like floating in space, watching my body do something. And that was the moment when, me and Dare were working together, and I was like, oh, wait a second. This violence thing that we do to each other, and I've done it too, when I recall all the times that I've been violent, like I'm harmed, I notice that I'm not actually quite in my body, right? And I feel like maybe folks on the call already recognize that there is some kind of leaving of the soma that happens when we enact violence. And in the most extreme cases of violence, like child abuse or things like that, that becomes even more apparent that is happening in the moment, if you're able to access that. So one of the poverties we have in our culture is the lack of access to stories of people when they have harmed, and true stories, not about how they were wrong, not about the past that made them who they are, but the live in the moment sensation-based account. There's very, very little actually out there, right? So that was something that was really a big informing part of my work. And when we start to understand that, I was like, wait a second. Both of us are going, actually Darius are more of an animist now. Yeah, so they were like, yep. But like, oh, this violence thing that we do, we are not necessarily in our bodies. So who are the agents of violence? And when we understand that violence is not something that we do because we want to, there is something else involved, then what you might say is then there are other stakes. There are other stakeholders in an act of violence within a community. So one of the things that me and Dare have been working on is to really question a human-centered version of justice, if that makes sense. Any kind of human-centeredness. So this can be highly provocative. It means that even survivor-centered there's a problem in it, because we're centering a human being when the agents of violence are not a human being, right? Because if we're really looking at the spirits are real, and spirit possession is a real thing, and we really anchor into the indigenous animist worldview, a lot of our systems for justice that are based on human responsibility start to unravel. And so out of that, we formed this idea of what does it mean to do justice work? And then that's where we moved into talking about ritual as justice, which is the name of our school now too. Because if violence is something that actually happens in the spirit realm, right? Because it's a spiritual matter on an innate level, then the only way we can get to true accountability is by working through our bodies as representatives of the spirit realm, but realize that the violence is actually conflict happening at a spiritual level often. So I don't know if that's like, but I feel like I don't know. I feel like maybe some things are landing. I know those are like really big ideas. But to even backtrack a little bit further, me and Dare's collaborative work, are in the realm of what we call cultural somatics. So cultural somatics is basically a type of somatic work where we recognize, if you know Jung's collective unconscious, right? Jung's collective unconscious, really Jung never put a body to that. Does that make sense? Like Jung never really described there being a body to the collective unconscious. But in our work, we actually say, oh, no, actually the collective unconscious actually has a body, right? So the collective unconscious actually has a body and a nervous system that we don't see. So how does this nervous system work? It works in very strange ways. So let's say I'm in a diversity, equity, and inclusion training at a board for a nonprofit. And it's mostly white people and white men, maybe as a head person in charge. And you start talking about racial trauma or racism, and then they start falling asleep. And is that boredom? No, but what we know is that falling asleep and turning off is a dissociation mechanism. And me and Dare's proposal is that that is not actually an individual phenomenon.
there is something that we might say is a cultural soma, so a cultural body that is going into dissociative response. And that looks like, when it plays through an individual, it looks like the white man in the room going to sleep. So when we extend that idea, we start to understand what is the true face of violence, then pain inside of the collective unconscious and the collective nervous system, right? Because in reality, we are all one soma, right? It's somas and somas, right? Nested, fractal Russian dolls of bodies entangled with each other. Even on this call today, there's a soma. We have created one, you know? So that is something that is really foundational to our work. And so what we understood from there is that if violence, as we see in our society, is actually unprocessed trauma in the cultural soma, so this intangible body that houses the collective unconscious, the agents of that collective unconscious are the ones that are actually moving through our body and manifesting and expressing that trauma as harm in our society. So the only way we can actually truly deal with that then is that you can put a human in jail. And sometimes, frankly, you need to confine people. I don't know about jail because, you know, like, I understand. But sometimes you need to isolate a person. But that trauma, because it's not, the originator of violence is not in that body, so they'll walk out of that door. You can house the body, you can confine the body, but they're going to find a way to get out of the room and go somewhere else and do the exact same thing. And that hamster wheel of violence is what we've been seeing in our society, because we're only dealing with violence on human-centric terms when violence is innately a sacred problem. And sacred, by sacred, I don't mean good. I simply mean sacred as in it deals with things that are outside of our common understanding. And our thesis is, and then until you really get on board with that, there's no solving of conflict or violence on a fundamental level. There's no foundational resolve. You know, yeah. So that's kind of like the sermon. And I don't know. Do we take questions here, Dare, or do you want to expand, or what do you think?
I think I want to just say, I just think I want to say one more thing, because like
That's funny.
the maps that we're using, and we're constantly updating the maps, come from a lot of places, and to explain it all in, 1 hour, 2 hours is kind of impossible. To understand it takes much longer. To use it in your life takes even longer than that. So I think that the curve for learning how to do this work in a really good way, where you're actually doing the process in your own body and it's not abstracted anymore, it's actually something you live, takes probably about 3 years of like really dedicated map transformation. Like your body map has to change, the way you make decisions has to change, and you have to find out good ways of doing that. And so it's a very long process, but it's actually possible to get quicker results because the map is more accurate.
Right.
So one thing I just want to say, to cap that off, is that most people are trying to find healing. So for some people, healing is relief from pain or relief from harm, relief from oppression. So I'm just going to say that what I found is that healing is an indirect, it's not direct, it's an indirect effect of redistribution amongst a network. Redistribution amongst a network. So imagine that there's someone, like an old Indian guru laying on a bed of nails. The reason they can lay on the bed of nails is because there's enough nails to distribute their force so they don't get punctured, and then they can just meditate with high sensation, right? It's like a meditative practice. But if there's not enough nails on that, it's dangerous. You get punctured, your container gets broken, and it's not okay. The same principle applies with families networks, group networks, cultural networks. When responsibility, pain, trauma, or force, right? When all of those things I'm basically talking about the same thing. So when force gets distributed, circulates through a system in equitable ways so that everyone's holding the right size piece of it for their lives, that's when we feel what we call healing. We're like, oh, I feel healed, right? But really, it didn't go away, it just got distributed.
So let me make this pragmatic, right? What Dare just said. like, let's say you have, white supremacist violence is such an obvious thing that we're facing today and looking in the eye right now. So our thesis is that white supremacist violence is an attachment wound. So what does that mean? That means that white people's, right, disconnection from their ancestral culture, which are their parents, right? So it's a family drama. So that pain then becomes internalized. And just like how if we have abuse history in our childhood, like I did and a lot of folks do, that pain is going to go out into the world when we become an adult and hold power in our relationships, right? So white supremacy works this exact same way. So there's this disconnection from culture that happens, and that becomes transmuted into violence when a person gains adult power, right? So that's the frame that we use a really attachment-based somatic framework for understanding that, right? So what does redistribution in that mean? It's that when a white person, let's say, is triggered in a moment, is that the proposal that we have is that violence actually happens because what is happening is that their ancestors' traumas are playing through them, and that innately is over the threshold, goes over the nervous system bandwidth to contain of that person. So what needs to happen there is this fundamental question of, is this anger I'm feeling or fear I'm feeling of the person in front of me, whether a Black person, Indigenous person, a POC person, or, in other cases, if they're a trans person, for example, what amount of that fear and anger and these other emotions are actually mine? And how much of them are my ancestors, and do I consent to feel them? And that is the distribution that Dare is talking about. Then when that happens, you're able to go, oh, that actually is not my feelings, and I don't consent to feel them, actually, because they're not useful for me today, as in my body, as in the history of the world, as I am today. They're not useful for me. And then there's a separation. That's what we call the distribution. And this redistribution allows us to bring our experience into the threshold of our nervous system. And so on the other hand, we also see that when people are surpassing their threshold of the nervous system, which is a necessary kind of premise for violence to happen in the first place, it's that there is a lack of redistribution there. And we need to find out what that is, if that makes sense. Right? Because when we talk about, let's say, like police brutality, the things we don't take account for, it's not just the social programming within police's carceral system. Every police officer brings their entire childhood history. Maybe their dad yelled at them, mom hit them, or like entire legacy of white supremacy and dissociation from the land, not knowing their ancestors, the school system they went through. Like everything is behind you in that, like each person in every moment has their whole life. And with whole life, we mean ancestral lives in that moment. And the key to undoing violence and conflict is to actually see that really very, very clearly, we found, and be able to redistribute the responsibility for that material amongst a network of beings. And so the work that we're going to dip in today, very kind of gently, is just to experience a little bit of what that is like. And so our work that we do, because me and Dare have been working through conflict, obviously we're collaborators, is that one thing that's been really helpful, at least in our approach, is we actually don't talk about, we don't start off with talking about what went wrong. The first skill that we want people to actually maybe try to absorb in ourselves, this is experimental, right? Caveat, is that what if we are each able to be responsible for basically doing, oh, this pain, this feeling I'm feeling right now, it's valid, but it might not be mine, quote unquote. And each person being able to do that and separate. So we want to do a little bit of a test of how we can dive, gently touch into that, see what that's like. Okay. Darren, do you have anything to add before we jump in? So we're at the 45-minute mark.
No, I think that it's when you experience it, then you have a lot more to a lot more to chew with, basically.
Yeah. I feel like we're like, this is like a conference, so it's like a dance class amongst 6 dance classes, right?
Yeah.
You're coming in, you're like, all right, guys, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. All right, so I think we're gonna do that. But you're also allowed to ask, can you, a quick question? Is that the two of you dealing with conflict? after class. Nice question after class. And so like, good try. Who's that, Liz? Try to sneak in there.
So Penelope is having some questions. Let me just answer it really quick. Redistribution sounds like separation rather than connection. It's not the same thing. Redistribution is spreading out versus collapsing, which is squishing together. We don't want collapse, which is this entanglement that's too entangled, it's too enmeshed, where you believe that, like, this happens for clients that I work with all the time. They feel their mother's feelings as if they're their own, but they're not. Mm-hmm. So if you can just understand that very simple thing that happens every day, most of television is about this. You just watch TV and you see this all the time, right?
May I ask the question? May I frame the question in a statement in terms of my own experience? Because I'm listening to you and I have a great deal of experience with this,
Great.
And my experience, what you're talking about is redistribution. What I experience, and because we're talking about embodied practice, the redistribution is internal in my world, because my mother's pain is my pain, because I was an egg in her womb when she was experiencing her trauma. So that energy, that energetic pattern is a part of my body. It's part of my somatics. Sure. And if I don't deal with it internally, then I'm not dealing with it. I'm separating myself from it. So what I'm hearing from you is that we put it back out into the ethers without the treatment on our own somatic harm that we carry around with us. So we continue to carry the propensity to react to that pain, to let that pain be triggered by trauma, if we don't deal with it internally as well as redistributing it. So this is a little thing that I'm hearing with you that I'm having a little difficulty with. So that's why I wanted to say that.
Okay. I mean, I understand that might be an interpretation, and you're landing into our work without prior experience with us, and we're in a conference format, which I realize that, people are coming from other workshops and stuff, which is very rare for us, but I invite you to hold that doubt, but also just experience the work, and this is not dogma, so you're just allowed to do that. And I think, to be honest, like some of those questions you have, I can answer you by explaining it, but I don't feel like it's almost like, without you having experienced it, it's kind of talking about something that's very abstract. Then there might be a few things in there semantically that we might not be on the same page about now, which might change if you just experience it. So I think that's my proposal. Okay, cool. All right. So let's see. Maybe we can start off with a little shake. So if folks want to, and you can participate any way you want to in this. You can just watch. You can watch Scooby-Doo if you want to. Starting a little shake, letting kind of worries and anxiousness and little bits of things fall. We're not trying to produce catharsis. We're just trying to get the right amount of activation for us to come back down again. And then we might already start settling. It's just that little bit so we can land back down. So I invite you to feel a little bit of that warmth that might have been stirred in your body. Noticing breath enter into your body very naturally. And letting yourself relax a bit, to let your breath drop a little bit lower in your body than it did before. And really let yourself notice the state shift. We had a little bit of activation and a little bit of deactivation. Notice your shift, or even if there is one.
So during this whole exercise, I'm just going to invoke the spirit of gentleness, the spirit of titration, that you don't actually have to force anything. In fact, forcing causes this re-traumatization pattern neurologically. So we're just going to go with the gentleness, and gentleness can be quite profound, but it's a skill, it's a practice. So blessings to the spirit of gentleness as we continue onward.
Yeah, and a little bit of transparency. So this part is just, I think, straightforward, chill. So the piece that we're going to do, we're just going to invite you to notice a little bit in your field of around a conflict. Oh, there is more than me here. That's all. And what we're going to do is notice that and get out. Okay, you're going to just touch that a little bit. Notice that, oh, there's more than me here in this conflict that I've been having. And then be like, okay, I'm going to move on now. And that's all we're going to do. Okay.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's first thing.
Yeah.
But also, you're allowed to participate in this in a way like, don't go into that at all and be like, I just want to savor the good. I want to stay at the buffet of feeling good. And you're also allowed to do that as well.
So I invite everyone to either remember or imagine a very beautiful landscape that they have either seen or been in, or even one that just comes right now, that's just right for you. So it's much more about what's just right for you right now. Some kind of landscape that you can picture, feel, sense. Could be a forest, could be the ocean. Everyone's got a different elemental landscape that is very beneficial for them if you just let it sort of open up. So take a moment to really enjoy it. Enjoy the conjuring of this sacred landscape, this beautiful landscape, in a way where you don't have to do anything. You could just receive it, or you could just see it. It could even be very small. It could be like a single tree. It could be like a rock. But something that holds this sort of non-human intelligence, this extra, this more than, that has an intelligence that's bigger, and we are on it. Right? And then allow yourself to just notice a few pleasant sensations that you get from this image. Just notice some pleasant sensations. Could be very subtle. Could just be like, oh, it feels a little soft here in my legs. Could be very simple. It's not about going on a deep shamanic journey. No, it's really just about staying here, but being resourced and allowing your body to have sensations based on these just right images of land that are coming right now if you just say yes to it.
Something that me and Dare say is make it boring but good.
Yeah, make it boring but good.
Yeah.
For you. And that's different. It's going to be different for everyone. I can't predict what it is for you. That's good. But when you feel like you're there, maybe you have to say some thanks. Maybe you have to walk around in the landscape a little bit before you feel like you can do this next part. So allow yourself to feel like, oh, this place is safe enough for me. It responds to my presence. From there, far away on the horizon, you just see a little piece of this conflict that you're dealing with. It could be a pain. It could just be as simple as there's pain in my shoulder, and I see it far on the distant horizon. Maybe it looks like an animal, maybe it looks like a shape, but it has this sort of ability. You have this ability to go, oh, right, there's this force, this energy, this being that's all the way over there that I can just see a little bit of. Right? And then start to notice what that does to your sensations. If you did use the example of like a pain in your body, notice if the pain diminishes when you do that. It may. I'm not saying it will, but it might. But if it's something more emotional or something more situational, like a family dynamic or something like that, you see that as a sort of complex or constellation of forces somewhere way out on the horizon, and just let your mind interpret it in just a kind of poetic way. You know, maybe you see like the cartoon Tasmanian devil rolling around in a cyclone, right? But it's way over there. And then you want to get a little bit more specific with what you notice quality-wise of that speck way over there. Is it a certain color? Does it move in a certain way? What can you describe? If someone asks you to describe it, could you describe it like, you know, maybe you have to use metaphors, but you could maybe describe it. Oh, it's like this big, and it's like this wide, and it moves like this, and the texture's like this. But you're always staying in a good place in your body. So you're not going into fight or flight or fear or freeze, but you're just looking at something far on the horizon. So if you have to like only be with yourself to like settle down before you do any of these suggestions, that's totally actually the first step for you, which is just like enjoying that you could summon a sacred landscape and actually feel good. That might be the thing that you are here today to feel. It might not actually be about conflict for you in this moment. It might be about giving your nervous system something that feels good, but just the right amount of good today. You don't have to understand anything else that we're doing, but if you got that orientation to subtle pleasure or subtle goodness, if you got that today, I would be very pleased.
And something that you might do in this moment is so we're not trying to heal anything. We're not trying to change anything today, because that's a little bit more acrobatic, but you might just take notes down. It's like, oh, this conflict as a being in the distance, far away, and you're like, I'm pretty safe. That's really far away out there. Like, you just might note like, what were its characteristics? Does it have ears? You know what I mean? Like describe it, and you might just take notes down. Be like, it looked like this being. And you're really meeting with curiosity.
Right.
You know, it's like, oh, I saw an animal in the woods and they look like this. You're taking a sketch kind of. And so I invite you to do that for the next 3 minutes or so. And again, we're not trying to change anything today. We're not trying to fixate on that in this moment. And about 30 more seconds. Gently wrapping up. And we'll be doing a slow exit, so you don't have to jump out yet. We'll take you out.
So, in a way that feels good for you, allow your eyes to go where they want to go in the room or the place where you are right now. Allow your eyes to go where they want to go. That really means don't look at the screen, but it also means don't tell your eyes what to do. Just allow your eyes to sort of scan your immediate environment. And when your eyes gaze upon something that feels good to look at, just allow yourself to have that. It could be a color, it could be an object, could be a shadow, could just be the blank wall. It's totally fine. And if you do that 1 or 2 or 3 times, just allowing your neck to move very slowly so that you can orient to right now, because you were just in a light trance where you weren't right here, right now. You were sort of in the nervous system's sort of interface. But now you're in the three-dimensional world and there are things around you, and some of those things might be resourceful for you now. So the trick is to really allow yourself to not skip these steps of feeling good, because it keeps putting us in our window of tolerance. Stephen Porges, polyvagal theory. You could call it window of resiliency. You could call it social engagement. You could call it play, the state of play. But there's a pocket in our nervous system in which we can access a lot of different options. It's not just one way or the highway. It's not just right or wrong. It's not just fight or flight. It's actually like a robust ability to choose and to play. But to do that, we can't control it. We can only shape the container by which that goodness comes to us. But we can't control what the goodness is or how it comes in a certain sense. And of course, this is very like quick, da-da-da kind of stuff. But this is the fundamental bit of reframing the negative attention bias, because our amygdala is constantly searching for threats. And that's why we become so hypervigilant, is that we just practice looking for threats and we will find them. But in these strategies, these practices, we're actually trying to give ourselves a moment of respite, a refuge from that threat detection that mammals do all the time. And to just go, oh, there's goodness right now. I don't have to wait till some later to have healing happen now, or goodness, or whatever you want to call it, pleasure. I don't have to wait. I could actually just sit here and let my eyes go, oh, I really want to look at the corner over there. Because the brainstem, there's a lot of science right behind this, but like the ocular nerves tap into the brainstem. It's very basic. And, this is what babies are trying to do. They're trying to orient. They're trying to like see what's around, how close it is, how big it is. These are things that are very important to mammals. Is something close or far? Is it big or small?
Hey Dare.
Warm or cold? Yeah.
I appreciate the knowledge sharing,
Yeah.
but I also felt maybe I wanted to go to the washroom.
Oh yeah, sure.
Maybe other folks want to take a little break before we really open up the casket. You know what I mean? Because then we might really unleash the demons. So maybe we can wait for 2 minutes.
Like a few minute break. People can go do whatever they need to do.
Okay.
we'll come back and answer some questions.
Hello. Hey, everybody. Hey, Seely. Cool. I called you out earlier, but I don't know if you heard me. So, hi, everybody. So, I feel like that was the class. That was like the Now we can kind of sit down with you for a bit, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. I think we're scheduled in for, I don't know, we don't try to go longer than we need to, but also we like to chat. So, but yeah, folks have any questions and stuff like that, I'd love to take them now. And we definitely hold the intention of kind of, yeah, describing the history of our work and where it comes from and the lineages. So, yeah.
Oh, and just one more thing.
Mhm.
I'm not going to be able to keep track of who does and does not want to be recorded, and Todd is also the one who's recording. So if you don't want to be recorded when you speak up, just say, hey, can you pause the record button? Because I can't hold that information, basically.
Can you pause the record button?
Any other thoughts or questions?
Just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi.
It's got Kelsey.
Yes.
Mhm.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning of this, so I'm not sure if you're sorry, my lighting's poor, but my thank you for this. I'm calling in from I think the same place as you, Tada.
Oh, what? Really?
I think so. Unceded Coast Salish territories, the Kwanganu Wasandiq
Oh,
peoples.
Oh, look, okay, no, I'm not in Victoria anymore.
Okay, I miss you then.
Yeah.
I appreciated the landscape, which for me was a very visceral. That's a tool that really is powerful for me to be able to like visualize and then feel in my body like being in that place. And it was I was sitting on a bluff, and I imagined the bluff before you even mentioned horizon, but it was perfect because I had a very good view of a very distant horizon. It was in the prairie, so it was the horizon was very far away. And then, yeah, the image or the piece of poetry, however, the conflict that manifested appeared as a ball of yarn, and like all sorts of, yeah, it was good, and all sorts of like, it was interesting because yeah, a lot of judgments came up about like, oh, it's tight and tangled, and like just
Yeah.
I think that was a bit of the cerebral part for me of like judging this ball of yarn. And then when you invited us to actually look at it a bit closer, and I was like, oh, I was like, okay, and it's actually quite soft yarn.
Yeah.
And quite pretty yarn, and a bit like, it looks like, you know, it wasn't neat and tidy, but it yeah, it was really like I melted a bit in terms of the tension in my body, of like being able to, I don't know, whatever happened there, like my intellectual judgments of that conflict that I hold, I was able to release a bit and to look at it a bit more, just like with curiosity, I guess, and seeing like, oh yeah, there's like some really lovely things happening with this object, and yeah, it's tangled and it's snared a bit. But the yarn itself is really beautiful and soft, and yeah, so thank you. I guess I don't really have a question, I just wanted to share that.
May I speak back to that, or kind of like take that?
Yeah.
Like, it's interesting because I was thinking about yarn, and I don't know, and since I've worked with Dare, I really try to understand that there's always gods landing in this space, if that makes sense. There's always spirits saying hello and flirting with us. And so I was thinking of yarn earlier, and then you mentioned yarn again. And this is a piece, I think, that was brought up earlier around, you know, Penelope, I think, brought it up around separation, connection, distribution. And actually the image I had to share was, it's interesting because it's actually not so much separation as much as like when we have like maybe a beautiful piece of like a cat's cradle or something, and then it gets really kerfumpled into a knot. But if you're able to, again, like go, oh, no, okay, I'm gonna untangle this knot. And literally this happens in our bodies, right? Tangle this knot and bring this out here, entangle this knot and brings it out here. Then you get actually a web that's coherent and connected, but it's still like, oh, this doesn't feel entangled anymore. It's not all one clump. It's not all just me. And it creates like a net. Yeah. So there's something about, I don't know, you bringing the yarn god, the spirit of the yarn back into the, or like let it express itself in the room. And I also just want to comment to that, that nature of our work is to let the animist world, such as the yarn, take hold of it. Like, it's like good possession. Does that make sense? Good consensual possession, and letting the spirit possess us in a way that you're like, are you good for me? Okay, yes, I think so. We're like, okay, I'm gonna let the yarn god take over and be present and possess the space as inspiration in a good way. So I know our experience of the yarn god is different, but they're also connected, you know, if that makes sense. Yeah. So thank you. And I can't believe we're not friends on Facebook. We probably are we? I don't know. We can talk about it later. I lived in Lekwanga in Victoria, BC. So, and I know a lot of people there. So that was kind of like internal chat. But anyways, yeah, any other thoughts? And anybody else want to throw themselves in?
I have a question about that. Oh, sorry, but I don't want to go to our head too quickly, because yeah, just during the whole end of the exercise, the practice, and the break, the last thing that my eyes laid upon when we were looking around and feeling good, a hummingbird came and landed on this little branch in front of my window and stayed there until just a few minutes ago, which is kind of, I think, maybe the longest time a hummingbird has ever kind of sat still before me. And they have a very important significance in my life. It's the Nahual, the spirit animal of my stillborn son. And so I want to just honor that and not go too quickly to this question, but I'm also curious. So thank you, Rafa. Thanks to you guys. When this question of possession, right? That's been a word that sort of stuck with me today, and one that I don't normally tango with, I guess I would say. One of the themes that's kind of up for me right now is, I'm not sure I like the word decentering. I feel like it's a little too heavy right now, but I guess imagining other agencies, right? So if it feels like so much of the way that we see and walk through the world in this modern Western kind of paradigm is like so human agency centered. So I have this question, what you just said, to who was it that just spoke? I don't see them. About the good kind of possession, or like giving consent to possession. How do you balance like the human agency piece that might say this is good or bad, but might come from a very cerebral or from past conditioning, versus like allowing yourself to just be taken by whatever what wants to entangle with you? Like how's that dance?
Right. So one of the things that me and Dare worked on is oh, okay. So Hara shows up. Hara is does anybody know? Do folks know? And I know you, Celia, you're on deck too. But Hara is the belly center in Japanese culture. Do folks know that word? Yeah, so Hara is kind of like a god that's very prevalent in my life. And on my ancestral healing journey, it was like, I'm a dancer, but I'm a street dancer. So I trained in like popping, which is kind of like what people might call hip hop dance now, but it's its own thing. It's a West Coast dance from the 1970s. But in studying that, I started to gravitate towards my own ancestral cultures, somatic practices, and this word called Hara came up, which signifies the kind of abdomen, the enteric nervous system, the gut brain, right? And its intelligence. And one of the things that me and Dare started working on when we met is like, how do we go into the trance world, knowing that there's so much entity out there into the world? What was the indigenous people's wisdom on being able to sort out what is all right for us to take in, right? And one of the things that we realized is that my work is based on this understanding that if you actually look around our colonial society, there's this general missing awareness of the abdomen itself. But when you go to Japanese culture, they tell you you have, like, the abdomen is the most important piece in being able to decipher input, because it's a digestive organ. Does that make sense? Yeah, Hara is a digestive organ. It's literally intestines. It takes in what is good, lets go what is bad. And bye, Kelsey. So the first piece then for us is to create a secure attachment with our body, especially through Hara, especially through our abdomen. So the kind of way that I describe the work that we do is actually a breathing practice with consequences. So the only thing that we really teach when it comes down to it is to breathe into your belly and regain sensation of your lower body, which just means to reassociate. That's all we really teach. And then there's consequences of that come, and that's the work that unfolds, if that makes sense. But at the root of it, it is just a breathing and a somatic practice. That's all that is there. The other stuff that we did, visualizations, are just something that enter your life because you're willing to open yourself up to that. This is kind of like the conceptual model that we're working with. Yeah, and Dare, maybe do you want to speak a little bit about Hara and plants and totally. Some lineages that affect you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was doing, lower Dantian is the Taoist Chinese term for the same place that we're talking about. And every culture, even if they're lost to history, had some idea of this truth, which is to say your incarnate self has a center where all of its power is, and you can cultivate that in a particular way. So what you'll notice in your life, if you start to like put your attention, like let your mind attend to this part of your body. If you actually start to do that over and over, just consciously attend to your pelvis and your lower body, feet, your legs, your tail, you'll notice when things get rough, energy will jump up out of your lower body into your heart or your head. This is just sort of, it just happens. It's like a normal thing that happens, and so don't be ashamed.
Yeah.
But what we don't do as a culture is we don't wait until that energy goes back down to the belly before we make the next decision. We actually assume that act, and you'll see this too. What's that thing you say, Tada? It's really quite genius. It's like, we have people who are like stuck in the head and people who are stuck in the heart, and they're both arguing about something they're both dissociated from, which is the gut, the pelvis.
Yeah, so that's the modern conflict between archetypal femininity and masculinity even. Masculinity being very mental and femininity being very emotional, and they're both arguing with each other, but they're both dissociated from sensation. So I am my thoughts, I am my feelings, but actually these both centers are both, when they're stranded on their own, dissociated from what am I sensing, which is their sensation level. And so to your question, I think, how do you know who to let in as a spiritual entity in your life? Well, what we suggest is that first in our bodies, we need to start developing some kind of premise for like a healthy relationship. And honestly, this is very hard because like, I'm human, so I don't know what a good relationship is, to be honest. Like we're figuring it out as we go, right? Let's be real. But I feel like most of us had this here, and we're like, our heart beats when we meet somebody new, and we, so our heart beats when we meet somebody new, right? And we're like,
froze a bit, but
oh, okay. So you know that moment when you meet somebody and your heart's beating, you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, right? And then 6 months later, you're dating them and you're like, why the hell did I make that decision? Do you know what I mean? Don't do that with your ancestors. Don't do that with ideas. Don't do that with plants. Don't do that with animals. That's the lesson, I think, is to like know that pouncing in your heart and that over threshold feeling that we so romanticize and enjoy is the discipline to be a little bit more integrated in that when we approach our relationships. And that's really the answer. So it's like very similar. It's to like, dating or anything banal like that. It's like, realize when you go fast and loose and your heart is beating, or when you get really cognitive, it's like, I think this person will be good for me because they check off these boxes. And then you're with them for 5 years and going, that was a huge mistake and I have to totally move out and reorient my life. It's like, don't do that. So that's basically kind of like what me and Dare kind of like started working on together. Yeah.
Another, and I know Seely's up next, but a good map. So someone asked about maps before. So maps need to be useful. They need to be accurate, but they don't ever tell you what the land is like, really. They tell you a bit. It's an approximation. But, like a cartoon snowman, there's like a really big base and then a medium-sized base and then a smaller base, and that's a snowman. When our hara is fully like integrated and we're moving from that place, and there becomes an alignment eventually where things get kind of cleared out in a sense. They get aligned. So basically your brain, your heart, and your guts are not arguing with each other anymore. But this is a trust building practice because most of us have some inner conflicts to work out. We're like, oh, I denied my own desire for 20 years. Well, that means your hara is going to have some things to say to you when you start to breathe into it.
Right. So this is kind of like where dance and stuff comes into the picture. Right, I'm going to just show you guys just very quickly. It's like there's like a motion in dance that's like this.
Undulation.
Undulation. In Qigong, you call that the microcosmic small orbit, right? But this is in a literal somatic way how to move information from your belly to your heart to your brain and back down through those channels, right? So that toning is also very important. And the consequences of that become the work, right? So just wanted to put that out there. And, this big, it's also like, I just want to consciously speak about my lineage because that's actually like a street dance thing where you learn to do different grooves with your body. That's different spinal undulations, which isolate and connect your head, chest, and pelvis, right? So mind, heart, gut. So that's the premise of street dance, being able to move all those things isolated but connected to each other, and integrated but separate. Disentangling emotion from thought and emotion from sensation, because we get those confused. We think our feelings are thoughts, vice versa, and we think our sensations are emotions, and vice versa. And sometimes we think our sensations are thoughts, and that's just, you're going, choo. So we want to separate and integrate. And yeah, Seely.
Hey.
Hey.
So I understand that you both have had an inaugural kind of cohort participating in a in school with you. Oh, here, sorry.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could share some about experiences of people who have now gotten some acquaintance and some initial practice with your system, and like, yeah, so some things that they have expressed that have felt quite useful for them, some kind of learning that's like, oh, this has been really changing in a helpful way. I'm curious also about any challenges that you've observed coming through with those folks, and then also what, like, where's the direction with this you are looking to kind of grow your own practices next?
This is a very astute question, Celia. It's good to see you. Celia and I know each other from so-called Montreal. So I was there about 6 months ago, and hope you're surviving the pandemic well, because it's like, I'm like, what is happening?
We're hanging in, yo, hanging in.
All right, bless you. It's good to see you. So I feel like the question that you're asking is a bit like, Dr. Hozumi, how does your health system achieve results? And I'm very happy to answer that in a very funny way, because I don't take that seriously. You know what I mean? It's hard I can't take myself that seriously, but one thing is definitely, I'm just gonna go over the top, and some clearing of autoimmune illnesses. That's like a marker that I have. Actually, everybody's like, "Ooh, really? Mine can go?" Yeah, it's like, that's actually a big part. We have a thesis that autoimmune illnesses are pretty much, most of them are ancestral dysfunctions. So ancestral traumas in the body that have accumulated over time that are manifesting in the present day, in present day environment. And that's not just an intergenerational level, but if people are saying, well, that actually, no, that's not true. This is because there's all this poison in the soil. Well, is that ancestral trauma or not on a cultural level? Right? So the cultural somatic way of seeing the world isn't, the body is not just here, but the earth is our body that we are part of. So if there's poison in the land, that's obviously ancestral trauma. Let's say poison or body, right? Like, we don't separate that. So, but maybe Derek can share their story of their autoimmune and remission miraculously through our, yeah.
So yeah, you froze a bit. I don't know if I froze. You froze.
Yeah. You know, you're like a super success story with their magical system.
Yeah, you mean the success story, which is basically like, struggle, be confused, keep choosing love from the spirits, even when you don't understand it, until you understand it to a point where you keep going, and then you keep going and you keep going. Yeah, so that's the thing, but it takes like 10 years, right?
Give your story in 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, I mean, but the reality is that I had severe autoimmune dysfunction in my guts from age 28 to like 35, essentially. And I cleared up a lot of it with.
You just said I had severe autoimmune system in my gut.
Yeah, so, and I did a lot of things. I did a lot of things with that. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
okay.
you.
I had to learn how to like not take allergens into my system and all this stuff. But even when I cleared up most of it, which took about 4 years, so like imagine I just couldn't, like I had bad constipation and diarrhea for 4 years. It was like destroy my life, you know, like it was terrible. It was a bad trip, and I thought I was going to die all the time. And when I cleared most of that up, I thought I did. The symptoms were gone. And I went to help a coworker move his mom's garage or something, right? Like clean out her garage. And when I came back, I got a cold and it didn't go away. And I almost died from fungal pneumonia because my lungs got completely taken over by this fungus within like a week. Now, if you've studied Chinese medicine, you'll understand that the lung and the large intestine are basically the same system. They look different, but they're the same system of clearing out toxins. But also Chinese medicine talk about this, excess mucus is ghosts. They say excess mucus is ghosts in your system. They're talking about ancestral trauma, but they just say ghosts, hungry ghosts. So I really experienced that. And after I healed from the pneumonia, I was a complete mess. Like my nervous system was shot, completely gone. I couldn't walk down a city block without like almost falling over. Like I like lost 100 pounds in 7 days, right? Like it was crazy. And I had to rebuild from there. And it took me many years to rebuild. But one of the things that I figured out when I was still getting sick, because I was still getting like colds all the time, right? When I finally cleared up, almost like I did a lot of ancestral lineage work, talking to ancestors and sort of demanding that things go back to like, I'm not responsible for all of your problems, but I love you and I won't abandon you. And I would see visions and have deep, like cathartic effects and trembles and shakes, but I was really trying to heal something quite deep in my system. When I finally finished the last bit of that, I haven't gotten sick in like 2.5 years. When I used to get sick like every few months and in the winter, like all the time, like just like a respiratory infection. Let me tell you a little bit about the backstory. My grandfather on my mother's side, Swiss man, died of emphysema when I was 3. It's a lung disease, right? I got a lung issue when I was 33 years old that almost died. I kept getting sick after that when I was about 39, so like 38, 39, so only a few years ago. I went to an herbalist and told him about my problems, and they said, oh, there's this lichen, usnea, that you could take. And I like slapped myself in the head because literally 6 months before in the summer, I was going through this forest talking to my dead grandfather about his beard and collecting all this lichen off the tree because it reminded me of his beard when this is when I was like 0 to 3 years old, right? So, and then this person is telling me, oh, this is the medicine you need to take for your lung issue. And I'm like sitting there, it's like on my altar, right? Like I'm just like a total whatever, you know, I'm like, oh, okay. These are moments that I had and have continually where it's like, oh, this isn't made up. I'm not making this up. Like I can't make this up. But so it's a little bit like I can't prescribe it for you, but I can tell you that I went through it. I can tell you that this stuff is like, everything is connected, but we have to get the right way to navigate the breadcrumbs, essentially. And it's not like miracle cures. It's about, it's like doing a martial art. You get more like wily. You become more like a feral cat or something because of the way you have to sense these things and actually integrate them into your life in ways that would change your belief systems. Because if you told me this 15 years ago, I'd have been like, no, I don't want to be crazy. I don't want to be a crazy person, so I can't listen to this information. But then I go through all this sickness and I'm suddenly like, I'll listen to whatever's, whatever. But it starts to organize in a certain way. But I had already been doing horror breathing for a long time but then I was doing it much more acutely in the lead up to that little Uznia story I was telling you about. So all through that 6 months of going in the forest and all that stuff, I had already known Tada. I was like breathing into my hara more and more. And then things just started to go like this, like it's a rhythm started to appear. So I just started to like look at that pattern more and more. And of course, there's lots of other patterns included in that story that we're not getting into. So it's not like, oh, simple magic bullet. It's not about magic bullets. It's just about listening to the connections and really going, oh, if my grandfather had had access to this 40 years ago.
And if you want to learn more about that kind of paradigm around the gut microbiome and stuff like that, there is like a lecture video up at our website called Whiteness as an Energetic Embodiment. So it looks at white supremacy, or what people call white supremacy, or all oppressions really, as what it looks like as an energetic phenomenon. And so you can go to the ritualsjustice.school, ritualsjustice.school here, I can put it in here, to get that. And there's a free webinar under lectures where you can just watch it and you'll understand kind of how we think about trauma and oppression, how it's passed down through generations, and how they manifest as things like autoimmune illnesses, like as, you know, as an internation or trauma. But in terms of like the challenges, I think the challenge, and this is like the presumption that we're right, which is not necessarily like a fair presumption, but I think the conflicts that we've been getting into, not between me and Dare, but me and Dare have been in, a lot of it is around what we call mimetics. So, you know, ideas are entities, right? Ideas are gods, and gods are fighting in some sense a share in the marketplace of our cognition. Ideas fight each other for turf and use our bodies to fight that war. That's kind of how we see it a little bit. So every time there's a new idea, there's a conflict that manifests in your community because the ideas are having a conflict, and because we conflate the ideas having a conflict with us having a conflict, we end up with this violent thing that happens, and people go over threshold. And I think on our end, we've definitely have been like, we're a new idea. We present new ideas, so it's inevitable that we get into conflict over these ideas, if that makes sense. Like, and I think particularly, we definitely position me and Dare's work, particularly within cultural somatics. Not everybody does that, but we definitely kind of present it as a kind of a post-activist, post-social justice theory way of thinking. Because when we think about oppressions and stuff, me and Dare don't necessarily look at privilege and power. Like, we, for example, look at privilege as dissociation. I mean, we use really neurological terms and understandings to talk about the phenomena that people talk about in social justice discourse. So privilege is really not material wealth and all that stuff. In reality, it's a mechanism to dissociate people from the real pain that's in their community. So privilege, otherwise privilege doesn't really matter. It's just goods. But what's painful about it is that it's a dissociative mechanism. So when you try to rip it from somebody's hands and they don't want to be dissociated, they want to maintain the dissociation, then there's a violent nervous system response. So that's how we understand it. But this type of understanding leads into some very strange things and strange languaging. And I think for folks to really understand that, it's a little bit difficult, if that makes sense. Because we, for example, we also use an attachment frame. So when we talk about anti-oppression work, we look at it as secure attachment work, right? And that actually places responsibilities on people in ways that is a little bit counterintuitive, right? So for example, when somebody comes to me and they're a white person, they're talking about allyship, right? Which is a very important part of conflict. And I was like, I don't necessarily first go to how do you redistribute your resources? I actually kind of go to, how do you, let's say you're a white person, especially you as a person who's ancestrally detached from your culture. Like generally, those folks have had the longest amount of time of dissociation from their cultural roots, right? How do you then become a developmental adult in a cultural sense. Like, forget about the redistribution stuff. I know it's really urgent for you to do that, and you're going to get to that. But the first moment I want you to take up is you have real safety in the world. You're allowed to walk through a park at night and not worry about, you know, a police officer talking to you and getting shot. You have real safety, and not all white people are the same, but you know what I'm saying? And just make a general description. If you have access to real safety in the body, and like I do too, I have a lot of the time, it's really contextual. You have the responsibility to be a developmental adult, to become an adult in that relationship. And that doesn't necessarily mean always listening to what BIPOC people say, because a developmental adult does not do that. They have discernment, they have autonomy, and their solidarity comes from a place of autonomy, right? So this is like kind of the paradigm. It starts shifting a bit because a lot of the stuff in the social justice discourse is probably, there's a bit of friction in how we think, although the goal is the same, if that makes sense. The goal obviously is the same for us, but how we imagine getting there, we really try to stick to a neurological, animist, and attachment lens. Those are probably the three things that are really pronounced is neurology. So you're really looking at the like things like privilege, or you know, even intersectionality. Intersectionality, we call it kind of trauma biodiversity. So trauma is a being, right? That in every body it's different. So if you have a Black queer body, it has a particular species of trauma, a particular being of trauma. It has particular shades of colors of fur. That's different from, let's say, like middle-class white trauma. But what happens is when all the traumas get together, they all party together and act the same because they're still part of the same species. But there's a biodiversity, and that's how we interpret intersectionality, for example. So the frameworks that we really use is really neurological, really animist. So, like, you know, everything is being and all beings are interrelated. And then attachment. So we're really looking to build secure attachment, even though we're human beings, so we don't know what the fuck that is. So those are the pillars, like neurology, animism, and attachment. And obviously we pull from, for neurology, we pull from all of like the, you know, Asian somatics, you know, South Asian somatics, all the spiritual traditions of the world, and then modern, you know, somatic psychotherapy. And then attachment, of course, is, you know, a whole field in and of itself. And then the animism, there's, you know, indigenous, like, yeah, indigenous animism around the world, particularly like ideas we love is like Wetiko, if you know Wetiko, W-E-T-I-K-O, which is a Algonquin name for a cannibal spirit. So that's something that's been really inspirational to us. Another a line you might follow is a film called Hollow Water. So it's Hollow Water is a group in Manitoba, I think, so-called Manitoba. It's an indigenous reservation where they started doing healing justice rituals where they call in their ancestors. And because in a small indigenous like community, disposability is absolutely impossible, right? So that's a NFB documentary. So I invite you to go check that out. So that's called Hollow Water. So those were like inspirations for myself. And yeah, it's hard getting all the reference in. And also like Anaiza, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Hello.
Hi.
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 Did I get that right or wrong? I probably got it wrong. Sorry?
Anaiza.
Anaiza, okay. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for all that you're sharing. I could say so many things. There's so much resonance. This is everything you're speaking to, and you've really just like highlighting, I mean, you're talking about colonized nervous systems to the way, like how that interacts with the subtleties of our own system that's like outside in some ways, like the normative political structures, going into like just how thoughts are interacting with our body. I mean, I just really appreciate everything you're sharing because it's so much a part of my personal world. And it's really amazing for me to see it so evolved in a way, like an evolved system. That's really incredible, and I really appreciate everyone's like questions and sharings, and also just even pensing what Penelope shared, because I just feel that all in this field, and it's it's just present, and I just really appreciate this time for witnessing it. But I wanna, my reason for raising my hand is I'm just curious how you'd respond to family, like systemic family constellations. And okay, I was just curious, like how that interacts. It's super similar, and so it's like, okay, yeah. I was just curious, how you respond to that.
So basically, can I feel this one? You want to do it first?
It's
a conflict. It's a conflict.
Yeah, I think one person I wanted to acknowledge inside of that was Sobonfu Sohei in the spirit of intimacy, because somebody mentioned Malidoma. You know, can't let dudes take all the space up, but like Sobonfu Somei's spirit of intimacy in their work, I invite you to go. I think it's just like related to the question, but I think I just wanted to put that out there because I think you'll fly off that platform, and I'm gonna shut up now.
Yeah. So when you look at animism and indigenous cultures cross-culturally and you try to look for patterns, you end up seeing pretty similar patterns, even if some of the content is different, right? Like there's different gods in every culture, right? But then there's certain patterns where you're like, these are sort of like the same being, or they talk to each other really usefully, like the world tree. You look for the world tree, you're like, wait, how did all of these cultures have the world tree and all serve the same function? There must be something going on here behind the scenes. So family constellations, if you know any of the history, Bert Hellinger, which is like a European white guy, he went down to Africa and watched the Zulu people do rituals and then had a great idea about family constellations. So I could look at that a few ways. I could say that Bert appropriated Zulu culture to create this sort of like thing where white people could get possessed and no one would talk about it that way.
Yeah.
I could say that. And it's kind of true. But I could also say that whatever spirits were there at that Zulu ritual blessed Bert with a little bit of help. I could say that too, and that's actually also true. And so this is the paradox we're in, where it's like, oh, morality is really weird when we're talking about non-human entities that are entangled with us in a deep multi-100,000-million-year relationship. So we have to become very okay with that poetry of like, oh, is it a bit of appropriation? Probably. Has the culture taken it to mean something that maybe Bert didn't originally mean it to? Probably that's also in the mix. So it's getting more and more complicated, not less complicated. But then we can also say, but wait a second, who are the spirits that are coming when people do systemic constellations that would bring such healing to white people that have no training in ritual? That's also really profound to me personally. It doesn't mean that the white people should be going and doing ritual without like a lot of training, but it does mean that if it clearly does something for them without much training, they enter into the workshop, something happens that is profound for them. Okay, it's not easy to say, it's not easy, and that's also the good part for me. I'm like, great, it's not easy. It shouldn't be easy. It should actually be like a relational, this is what a relationship is. It's not easy. It's complicated, right?
And so lifting off what Dare is saying, so there's family constellations is one modern format, modern being that has that indigenous animist seed inside of it. That's very similar. Process work, process-oriented psychology, Arnie Mundell, if you guys know that, is one. That's another modern format. And then there's restorative circles, which comes through Dominic Brouwer, who studied in the favelas of Brazil. So I guess, we can probably garner where all that comes from too, right? These are all indigenous modalities in origin. And then the work in hollow water, restorative circle practice, indigenous law, indigenous restorative justice law, which I find really different from like our kind of social justice-y brains restorative justice law. It's a whole different animal. It really trusts the ancestors and spirit realms. These are all things that, me and Dare don't facilitate right now, but our work is moving towards trying to understand them and kind of like combine them all together to create like an open source framework that and the experience you had today of noticing the being on the horizon is kind of like a part of it, like, because part of me and Dare had I think we can be transparent on our conflict, because we already talked about in our interview. Like, we actually recorded our conflict resolution thing on our interview, if you go back to our call. But I have a school that I opened together with Dare, but I just have a lot more of the stakes in it, I guess, is like the easy way. Like, I pay the bills and stuff like that. And Dare was like, I want to go off and do my own course. And I got fragile about, but there was like, I don't know how you describe your state, but there was a bit of like that thing, that happens when lineages of knowledge want to separate, want distance from each other. Not maybe separate, but want distance, right? I think that's the best description.
It's not disconnection, it's divergence. And
that's
not a bad thing, because divergence precludes convergence. This is like the DNA sequence, right? This is like everything in the world is spiraling around and going like, I'm going to come together, I'm going to diverge, and I'm going to be different. And now I'm going to merge and have a empathic feeling together. And now I'm going to be very different. So this is like what mothers and children do, right? They like come together and then they go apart. But if you do it in a right way, hopefully one doesn't freeze and the other one does this, right? Or if both freeze, then we're like, oh, like you could freeze like this. You could freeze like this. You could freeze like this, right? Approach, avoid. It's all attachment stuff, right? So, but if we could do this, if we could just do this more often, then when the attachment wounds come up, like what Tada just mentioned, like I want to do my own thing, or a thing that's sort of over here, but it's not right. Attachment wounds are bound to come up because it mirrors our families of origin or our cultures of origin and all the unprocessed stuff when people wanted to diverge and couldn't, or when people were forced to do something they didn't want to. So you have to just sort of feel into that and go, okay, so where are we in this process? And how do we, when you go back and if you go back and watch that interview, you'll just see that like we were able to do a little process with some of the beings that were holding our feelings for us, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. So kind of what we did was like, you'll see it as like witness, like we did the same thing, drop into beautiful landscape and, oh, who on the horizon is out there connected for us individually with the problem. And we both had separate beings and we're like, oh, but instead of making us about ourselves, we were like, oh, this is outside of us. And so this is kind of the family constellations thing, like being able to manage it on our own is kind of the work that we've been doing. And we had this whole sequence of like describing the being and then introducing the being to each other through our bodies, but we're never taking each other personally. So this is like this kind of animus formation where the family constellation intergenerational work, the process work around like kind of big ideas as like racism as a being walking into the room. So we were imagining like, what would it be like to be in a conflict and somebody's talking, they're like, and I felt like you did something racist. And instead of saying like, you're racist or any of that formation, being like, the spirit of racism. Does anybody want to take up the spirit of racism as a clown in the middle of the constellation? They walk in and the spirit of racism is in the room as themselves autonomously and having to work with them. So that's kind of the idea of what we're thinking about, is really creating this like group digestion of these spiritual entities, by kind of like remixing a few things together. And so that's kind of like, processing. And Isa, do you have anything to say on that?
Thank you for your responses. It was Dara's response was what it was a surprise to me, but I appreciated it. And I just been doing constellations for about 3 years, like facilitating them, and I do a lot of intuitive work. And so I'm also wanting to, as it comes to Bert Hellinger, I've really somatically sat with the Zulu tribe, and so I just really appreciate what Dara was sharing and how I'm kind of wanting to step out of that specific paradigm and more into kind of just what you're talking about, like what's present and how do we name what's present in a outside of a modality form, but like inside our sensing form. And this is something I'm really
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Sorry.
I just have so much resonance with everything you're sharing, and it's like really what I'm exploring in my own work. And I'm gonna send you an email.
Yes, I was gonna say that because I think exactly that's the thing that we're struggling with. How do we make this? The modality is just a container, but in the sensing form is where it can really live. And
Yeah.
sometimes the modality is just the container to learn the thing that we sense. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, send us an email, please. Yeah, thank you so much. For the hour. There's 2 persons. How do we do this, Dare?
We probably don't have enough time for everyone, but Helen was first.
We can go over by 10 minutes, Dare?
Sure.
And then we'll try to be minimal in our response. And then also, if anybody needs to go right now, it's all good. But we might do a final closing exercise. It might be 15, but we'll see. Yeah.
By way of reinforcement and gratitude and reporting, the program right before this was Family Constellation led by Allison Formes. And this week I was in a family constellation led by Allison, and there was a prisoner, a warden, a prison, and a liberation. And I said, I'm going to wait and find out which one I'm going to be. I'm not going to say which one is calling me, but I was told to be liberation. And what I said as liberation with this family constellation this week was a quote from the Irish poet Yeats: "For love is but a skein unwound between the dark and dawn. Men come, men go, all things remain in God," which comes from something called Crazy Jane and the Bishop. So I wanted you to have that.
Thank you, Helen. Nice to see you again.
Can I just briefly say I used to co-facilitate constellations with Allison Fornes. So that's just fascinating that her name came into the space.
Love Allison.
God's land, right? God's land.
Yeah, that's something there.
Rosa.
Hi.
Hi.
So what do I want to say? Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I have seen your work online before.
Oh, yeah.
I am especially appreciative about your exploring alternative, I don't know how to put it, but alternative social justice frameworks. And it's not an easy role to be in. There's a lot of, either you're with us or you're against us kind of polarization in the social justice world. So I just want to really appreciate your work towards opening up some space there. And this question of how do you become a developmental adult feels really powerful. And then I'm really into the brain science stuff and attachment and also the animism. And I guess I'm going to take a risk and say something possibly unpopular here, which is just that, oh gosh, like, yeah. So it's complex. It's not a simple thing. And at the risk of being misunderstood, it's like there's so much damage that comes amongst human beings, like when we kind of point fingers at each other and, oh, this person is good and this person is bad and whatever. And it's really good to get systemic, and it's really good to be able to, have empathy for all sides and all that. And when we're going to the spirit world, it's like, it seems to me like a lot of tribal cultures have said, there's like friendly spirits and there's like some really gnarly ones that you kind of want to be careful about, right? And I get concerned because I feel like people who open up to the spirit world tend to do it with this like Western culture. Oh, it's all good, man, and it's like, it is not all good. I mean, that's not what any traditional will tell us. And so your whole thing about responding to the question of how do you know, and you're kind of being provocative, like what's the difference between inspiration and possession and whatever. And I put consent there, because I do think consent is really important here as well. And the thing about what do we give our consent to? And I just want to say this, especially because in the constellations realm, there are people who kind of play fast and loose with this thing in a way that I have not been very comfortable with. So just wanting to speak out for that.
Totally. And thank you for adding that. And I think one of the pieces, consent, I think, is a really interesting subject when you get into the spirit realm, especially. But because we're essentially mostly portals that are unconsenting all the time. If you look at somebody who's a sociopathic, that is, they're unconsenting being to all the spirits. Essentially what is happening. The person has left the body and they're just a straight, like, pouring out of the spirit realm. And the consent piece is important, but I think there's also this other piece that dances with that, which is the desire piece. And that, I think, is like a big part of, it's like, what does our body desire? And this is a very, bye Celie, this in itself is a difficult question, right? Because desire is so tumbly for us. And it might be desire and pleasure or well-being or something like that. There's some sense of the body moving forward in the right direction. And this is the thing that's really hard for us to tell, because so much of the time, like, you see, when you, okay, I'm getting a little provocative, when you look at the accounts of women who slept with, let's say, Charles Manson, you see them having amazing spiritual psychic experiences. They're crying, they feel connected for the first time in their life, and they feel seen, right? And so it's one of the troubles that we have is that the good feelings, quote unquote, that we experience in our life are exactly the toxicity. And understanding that on like a deeper level is a very, very, very challenging thing, I think. And that's kind of why we, me and Dare, talk about is keep it boring. If that meant keep it boring but good, because it's not about good or bad. It's sometimes just amplitude. Like too much of a good thing, like frying our brains. And a lot of the kind of formations that we see around us are explicitly about that. Like when and so that's kind of like why cults form around these powerful ideas, because people have amazing encounters. It's undoubted they have amazing encounters, but they haven't. They're not able to really get on board with it. Their bodies get blown out.
Yeah.
And so I think the key piece around this discernment is to really get comfortable with the spirit of just boring goodness. It really is. Yes, Rosa. And I think that's a great, I know if you talked to it's activating things today, and I'm diving into it today because it is around violence, spirit, possession, and conflict. So, I felt like the trigger warnings were there ahead of time, so we're diving in. But I want us to come out in a good way. And if there's any way in this moment right now you can attune to the spirit of boring goodness, I invite you to. If there's any moment today, or in the last week, or in this session today, that you felt a state of like, it's boring but good, or it's boring and good, or it's good because it's boring, I invite you to hold that in your body and be like, oh. For me, it's just watching a bee kind of fly around my garden right now. That's it. So the state you're in right now, and this boring goodness, is the state I suggest, that we're just proposing. Kind of like a blanket on the grass where we can kind of start connecting to our ancestors, plant beings, animals, neighbors, gods, and other beings that we connect with. And yeah. Dare, do you have anything? I feel like I talked a lot today.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's okay. I mean, really what it is the school is called Ritual as Justice because it's not an easy answer, but we thought that in order to start to get to know the various spirits that are already here, already sort of like playing with our lives, interfering with our lives, co-creating with us, that the best way to do that is to create open source, really neurologically sound ritual protocol for today, for the world that we're in today, in the Western world specifically. so that we can disentangle all of the spiritual and religious trauma that people have, and so that we can also like be in our bellies without constantly going over threshold by taking in too much stimulus and chasing peak experiences, or even just like peak anguish or grief experiences. It's the same thing to the body, is that we're not, like, if we can't hold that amount of current running through the system, it's going to fry us, and it's going to do something neurologically, which, you know, is like a 2-hour webinar, you know, talk, right? But the point is just that this peak and valley thing that we do in our culture, drink a lot of caffeine and then like take sleeping pills, right? It's like this kind of thing that the cultural body is doing is not the same as like really having concentric circles of being with various levels of reality and the spirits there that are in our lives, and really taking the time to enter and exit very slowly, so that there's these arcs of choreography that actually help our systems integrate, rather than just like eating experiences over and over again. It's not, we're not trying to make it fast food healing, you know, it's not like that.
Thank you, everybody.